What's going on, everybody? Um, this is probably going to be one of the shorter videos because it's only one variation and it's not too long. This is called the Wiel Attack. It's also a variation of the advanced variation, which is E4, C6, D4, D5, and then E5. So, just like all the other lines, the bishop comes out first, develops to F5, and instead of like the short variation where the knight comes out on the king side, this time the knight's going to come out on the queen side because those pawns on the king side are going to start marching, and they're going to start marching fast. So when the knight comes out to C3, black goes ahead and closes up the pawn structure as normal with a push to E6. Now, what makes the Wiel attack the Wiel attack is this move right here. It's a pawn push, and that pawn's covered by the queen, so you're already tickling that bishop right off the bat. You know, black did all it could to get the bishop outside of the pawn chain, and it doesn't have many squares to run to now, so white is going to try to use that against black. The only safe square where it wouldn't get, it doesn't have the option to get killed right away would be G6. Now you could move it to, E4, but the knight could technically come in and scoop up your bishop. And then if you look at the computer analysis, it's almost up by 2 pawns, and that pawn on E4 would fall really fast. So you move it back to safety to G6. From here, white is going to go ahead and develop the other knight to E2. And just like all the other, lines in the attack, that pawn gets pushed to C5, trying to hit up that backward weak pawn, D4 right now. So the Wiel attack is actually a 2-pawn fiasco, and that's when the H pawn gets marched up to H4. And if you saw my classical videos, volume 2, which is the first actual game analysis, since volume 1 is just the intro, you should know that when they march H4, they're looking to trap your bishop. If you did something naive, they would come in like this, and your bishop's trapped. You don't really have the option to march up your pawn 1 here. That's kind of weak sauce. I mean, you can, but it's not the right thing to do, because then you're just allowing black to have a pawn formation where one pawn guards the other in the natural direction of a pawn chain. So you want to go ahead and march it up twice, and you still maintain the advantage when you do that, rather than, the computer says -5 as opposed to +2. -5 means negative is black advantage, positive is white advantage. So from here, white will bring in its knight to F4, tickling that bishop again. It's just harassing that bishop. It must have been a pedophile or something, because they're not letting him go. The only safe square now to back up to is tucking it right in that corner. Tucking it good. From here, white has the option. So he marches up his pawn again. Has a nice pawn formation, so one pawn covers the other, and takes away that H6 square and F6 square from the knight. So now the knight, this G knight, is very limited. It's the only way it could develop now is the e7 square. So what does black do here? If you do some calculations, you can take this pawn, because the queen really doesn't want to capture that pawn. So you're kicking out the knight that's sitting on c3. If the queen were to come in and take the pawn, the knight would be able to develop and attack the queen and kick it out. And once the queen kicks out, the pawn on e5 would fall, unless the queen moved to a4, pinning the knight. It's almost forcing the hand of white. So that would be a real bad move by white to capture that pawn when it can just move the knight. And if you want to, continue the line, the queen could move to c7. That would be attacking that weak pawn too. So white instead goes ahead and develops its knight to b5, which is a safe square. And now it's attacking the pawn from the sideways direction on d4. The pawn that we just captured, now that knight's attacking it. So we're going to take this opportunity, now that the knight that was on c3 was covering the e4 square, was preventing our bishop from going there. Well, since it freed it up, we're going to go ahead and move our bishop there and attack that rook in the corner. White has the option to block with the bishop. It could technically lose ground with the knight. It could even move the rook. But the best thing to do, if you have the option, you guys should know this by now, is to move a pawn and kick them out. So now that bishop has a free square on f5. White's going to go ahead and capture the pawn on d4, harassing that bishop again. They're just not letting him go. But the f5 square in particular in the Caro-Kann is a beautiful square for a knight. It's an awesome square for a knight. I always try to plant a knight on f5 if possible, because usually white has a pawn on d4 where that knight is, where it can hit it from a second angle. Usually I have a knight parked on c6 and a knight parked on f5. Both together add two attackers in combination with my pawns and my bishops and my queen, where it overpowers them usually. So we can develop our knight from g8 to e7, guarding it. So we don't even care if the knight takes out that bishop. That bishop has it coming to him. So knight will take him out on f5, and you recapture with the knight from e7 to f5. And if you look at my pawn play 3 video, we should know that that square now not only is an awesome square for a knight, it's actually an outpost too, because now there's no pawns on either side on the g file and e file that can kick out that knight. Perfect. That is cemented. It'll always, until further due notice, cover the h4 square, the g3 square, the e3 square, the d4 square, the d6 square, the e7 square, and the g7 square. On top of the h6 square, all those squares, knight's covering. And if we know that it's going to go down, we can maneuver our other knight, jump it from, b8 to c6 to e7 to guard that knight and take its place. I mean, there's other routes, but that's the open one currently. So white is going to come in and move his bishop to d3, attacking that knight. Now, there's a slick move that black can do with some calculations. Queen to c7. And the reason is white can't take that knight yet because the queen would come in, grab a pawn with check, and it can't defend the bishop. So, I mean, the best thing the bishop could do would be, you know, back up here, and then it would be take, 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 and it would be a disaster. So before the bishop can take the knight, knight's got to back out. Now it's able to because that doesn't come with check. You understand? So when the knight moves from f4 to the e2 square, it allows us time to double up the defense with pawns on that knight. And that's such a strong knight that white is going to come in and murder shank that motherfucker to death twice with a rusty spoon. So we're going to capture with the G pawn. The reason why we don't want to capture with the E pawn is we want our pawns more centralized. If you look at the pawn islands, that's 4, 1, 2, as opposed to if we capture it with this pawn, now it's 4 pawns in the middle, a solo pawn on the flank, and 2 pawns on the other flank. And because of that, now that allows white to bring back out the bishop to e3, and we are going to develop our knight with a multi-purpose move. We're going to move it from b8 to d7 because, one, it's hitting the pawn on the e file. It's attacking this pawn now, and we're doubling up the guard. We're stacking up army defense on the c5 square because we want to plant our bishop there. So from here, white is going to consolidate its pawn chain, link everything up nice, push its f pawn, and now we can go ahead and move our bishop, testing the authority of white's bishop. So we're going to put our bishop on c5, check in the bishop on e3. And from here, white could either kill it, move it, but what does it do? It develops another piece and defends it. Brings in the rook to h3. And from here, there's something called a fortress. Some people don't believe in fortresses. I personally, I'm not really good enough to know. So I'm going to say I believe in them, just like unicorns. Don't hate. We're going to march our king to f1 with the idea to march it from, f8. And we're going to march it from e8 to f8 to g7 to g6. Let's just make up some moves here. White moves his queen. White moves his king. White castles. White moves up the black king one more time. If you look at the structure of it now, there's no way any piece of white is getting through those pawn chain to get to that king. Any attack on the black king would have to come all the way and circle around, and it would have to get through all white's army pieces on the queen side, on the D, C, B, and A file. The pawn on h8 might need to stay there to, make sure that that h5 pawn doesn't fall, but that is what a fortress is. So this is the Wiel Attack, and this is how to, escape it without losing your shit. And we're going to press on. I appreciate you guys. Catch you on the next.